Thank you so much for tuning in to Circling Dialogos. If you are inspired by what we talk about on this channel and want to dive deeper and in fellowship with others, there's a number of ways you can do that. One is to become my client and work one-on-one with me. We also have circling events every week open to the public. We also do weekend intensives for circling every 4 to 6 weeks or so. And we have a year-long Art of Circling practitioner training program. We also have self-study programs that you can do at your own pace. All the relevant links, including my email, is below in the show notes. Please let me know if you have any questions. Thank you for tuning in to Eckhart Radio. I am speaking from you live, well, at least live where I am right now, in Florida. And I'm sitting in I got an Airbnb in this big Victorian house in my favorite part so far of Ocala. And I'm sitting on the front porch, and the neighbor is doing some yard work, so we may get the sound of the weed whacker. Maybe you can hear that in the background. Hopefully it's not too disturbing. And even though I'm out on the porch in this beautiful day, I still could not find the moment in which I was ready to hit the record button. But here we are. And again, I just want to remind us that you too are a button pusher. And your button is very, very different from my button. In fact, irreconcilably different. Yet, between our two buttons, there we find each other. Again, in this strange relationship you and I have. We should talk about that relationship someday. And all of its inequities. So, I've been really thinking quite a bit about the last reading. And especially this analogy that he's talking about in reference to our relationship to God's will. And that one can hunger for God's will. And the analogy was that when you hunger for spiritual things is different from being hungry for like creaturely things. In that, to, in this sense, hunger or eat God's will, one just becomes more hungry. And the more hungry you are, the better something tastes. However, with ordinary things, and I think what he's talking about, what would be an ordinary thing is to not be able to see through the world into the source of the world, the underlying unity of the world, is to mistaken the depth from the surface. And when you eat the depth, you draw from the depth. There's a mutual birthing that goes on. And it's a birthing that just has you desire and hunger more for God. Yet when you fall astray, when you become mistaken, and you instead of seeing, experiencing, comporting yourself to the world such that the mystery of the world is not seen, is not accounted for, is not grasped, then that's just, you can get filled up, but only to be hungry again. And so these analogies, these metaphors, I think what I'm appreciating about them is just how relational this God self relation is. And really, I keep thinking about that in some very deep way. I think this parallels strikingly closely to Buber's notion of thou, of I thou and I it. And that in essence, I think Eckhart is basically proposing that the relationship with the ultimate, with God, is really authentic, just like in our relationship with people. That when I relate to another thou, in that moment, the I of thou co-arises. Because as Buber says, I thou is spoken as one word. So I'm not an I that then meets a thou. No. It's the relation. It's a relation. When I address thou and thou addresses I, that relation is there. And conversely, when I relate to something as an it or a means to an end, right? There's a particular I and a particular it. But the key is the relation, like the hyphen between the I and the thou. And in some very deep way, I really hear Eckhart in his preaching presencing this hyphen. And in some ways, right, in some ways, I think what he's doing is he's evoking the imaginal, right, in these analogies and metaphors, and the way that he's writing to understand what he's saying in some way is to really has us use the imaginal to enhance our ability to participate in the world. And that there's something really important going on here with this notion of living without why. And this emphasis that he has in whatever it is that he understands or means when he's talking about will, either God's will or your will. But there's something crucial in his understanding of will here that is mysterious to me. I don't know if I totally understand it, or at least I sense something in which I can't completely grasp, but something shines forth from it, and it draws me in. So with that in mind, I will continue reading. So again, the book is Meister Eckhart, Sermons and Treatises, Volume 2, translated and edited by M.O.C. Walsh. And I am on page 4. So what I'll do, like last time, is I'll read the last paragraph that I read last, and then we'll jump into the next paragraph. And I think we'll be able to read all the way to the end of this sermon, but we'll see. So at the top of the page, he says, now you might want to ask, how do I know if it is God's will? I reply, if it were not God's will for a single instant, it would not be. It must always be his will. Now, if you really enjoyed the taste of God's will, you would be just, I'm sorry, if you really, if you really enjoyed the taste of God's will, you would be just as if you were in heaven, whatever happened or did not happen to you. It serves them right who want anything other than God's will, for they are always in sorrow and distress. They often suffer violence and depression and are always in trouble. And that is just as it should be, for they act as if they were to sell God, as Judas did. They love God for the sake of something that is not God. And if they get something they love, they do not bother about God. Whether it be contemplation or rapture or whatever you welcome, whatever is created is not God. Scripture says, the world was made by him, and what was made knew him not. If anyone should think that to gain 1,000 worlds plus God were any more to gain God alone, but he would not know God or have the slightest idea of God and would be a bore, B-O-O-R. Therefore, a man should heed nothing but God. Whoever seeks for anything with God, as I have said before, does not know what he is looking for. So you can really hear in this, what he's emphasizing here. On one level, he's talking about something that is possible in every single moment, independent of the circumstance. That whether or not we love God's will and this fractal co-birthing of ourselves in God and God in ourselves and the fractaling nest. I keep picturing like a what do you call that? These those dolls that are hollow inside and then nesting dolls. I keep getting these images of that this I thou relational experience with God, realizing it's being in him loving us and us loving him. This deep mutuality that's going on is literally, he's talking about it, is in every single moment we can realize it, independent of any content, that the difference that makes the difference is where we're coming from. So like what he says here, this part, they love God for the sake of something that is not God. And if they get something they love, they do not bother about God, whether it is contemplation or rapture or whatever you welcome. Whatever is created is not God. So in other words, you would think, like if you're in contemplation, that's a spiritual thing, right? You're in rapture, that's a spiritual thing, right? You can go to church, you can do all the godly activities. Yet, if your attention or where you're coming from is mistaken. You can do all those things all you want, but if your context is off, it ain't God's will that you're loving. And there's something so inspiring about that to me. It hits me like a sense of this, that there's something deeply unconditional in this regard. That all it is just, I mean, just like in your relationship with people in your life. You know, you can, I mean, I've definitely noticed this in circling, which is where we practice kind of the minding the quality of the I thou relation. And like you can have all kinds of communication skills, right? You could dot your I and, do all the stuff that the books say. But really, what matters is where you're coming from. And if your context is off, the whole thing's off. Even if you do everything right, right? There's a sense, in which the level at which he's bringing our attention to, right, is a level of profundity that cannot be performed. It can't be. You can't work really hard and achieve it. Something else going on here, and it's this. I keep getting this sense, this context, this place in which we come from and address anything, everything. That it's that place that we're coming from is the difference that makes that difference. And this last sentence here, therefore, a man should heed nothing but God. Whoever seeks for anything with God, as I've said before, does not know what he is looking for. So this is one of the things that's really striking to me too, because, he's in some way, he's addressing how we see, right? Where we're coming from when we see. And what he's saying is that when you relate to something as an it, as a means to an end, and you relate to God as an it, as a means to an end, what he's saying is that you have forgotten what you're looking for. He says, and what I hear about this is the way he's presencing this is that even when I'm making God an it, right? Whether or not we know it or not, even in our mistakes, we're still looking for God, because that's the only thing that we could ever want. I hope you're enjoying this video so far. Just wanted to remind you, if you are interested in diving deeper in what we talk about here on the channel, in fellowship and in a more embodied way, there are a number of relevant links in the show notes, including working with me one-on-one as a client. All the information is below, including my email address. Thank you. So there's this kind of, he's, in some sense, he's really presencing our kind of, you could say, our ontological condition. And, well, I'll go on. Otherwise, it's going to take 20 years to get to the end of this. All right, so bottom of page 4. Here's the new part. Thus, the Son is born in us when we are without why, and are born again in the Son. Origen writes something very splendid. And if I were to say it, you would think it incredible. He quotes, "We are not we are not only inborn in the Son, we are born out and born in again, and are born anew and immediately in the Son. I say, and it is true, that in every good thought or good intent or good work, we are ever born anew in God, unquote. Therefore, as I said quite recently, the Father has only the one Son, and the less we turn our aims or attention to anything other than God, and insofar as we look to nothing outward, so we are transformed in the Son. And so far, the Son is born in us, and we are born in the Son and become the one Son. Our Lord, Jesus Christ, is the only Son of the Father, and he alone is man and God. But there is only one Son in one essence, and that is the divine essence. Thus, we are one in him. We have no thought but of him. God wishes always to be alone. That is a necessary truth, and it cannot be otherwise. We must always have God alone in mind. So this, I think, calls for a little bit of unpacking. This is quite an intense little paragraph here. So I'll go through it again, and we'll see what kind of sense we can make out of this. So he says, thus the Son is born in us when we are without why, and are born again in the Son. Thus the Son is born in us. Right? So here he's emphasizing in this first part that Christ, the unity of God and man, which Christ was the incarnation of that, of God coming to flesh. So that unity is born in us. And he says, okay, so the price of admission, right, is for that unity to be born in us is when we are without why. So when we are without why, this unity, this incarnation, the one incarnation, realizes itself, is born in us when we are without why. And here's the reciprocalness. And we are born again in the Son. So the Son is born, that unity is born in us, and then we are born in that unity when we are without why. Okay, so I think what this sense of what does it mean to be without why, right? Well, I mean, one way I guess we can think about that is like normally when we do stuff, there's a reason we do it, right? There's something that we don't have at point A, and that thus we go to point B in order to get B. So we go from not having to having, right? So there's this sense of, and that's would be our reason. We have a because, right? An ought or something like that. Yet I think what he's talking about here is that when you really realize God, God is not anything, God isn't a thing. God isn't an object, right? God, therefore, we aren't subjects over against an object that we can, like, constitute with our will, so to say. But rather, God is something like the horizon of all horizons, right? In other words, God is not a thing amongst things. So when we are really in relation with God, we aren't in a relationship with an it or a thing. Therefore, God can't be a reason. We can't have a reason, right? We can't go to try to accomplish something. Sounds like when we live without why, just like the rose blossoms without why, that we are so wholly in right relation and so authentic in that relation that that relation is realized in this mutual birth, this incarnated unity, right, is born in us and we are born in it. And so there's this, it's funny, I'm thinking about the notion of skole. This is sounding very much like skole in the Greek sense, where Ivo de Janeiro talks a lot about this in this way of that it's essentially when we are in skole, it's a relationship. There's something about the way that we hold time evokes time in turn holding us, right? It's like doing something, said more simply, it's doing something for its own sake. And so when we act in the world and we mow the lawn, we talk to our partner, right? We do our taxes, whatever it is that we're doing, that there is a that that if that if we are actually relating to God's will in the appropriate way, it's not a thing that we can accomplish, right? It's this depth of realizing it is the ultimate no thingness, the context of context. And that when we are living from that place, coming from that context, that by definition we there's no why that we're doing it, because we are already fully at the ultimate. And therefore our acting and our speaking and our relating, everything is realizing this ultimate. There's no gap between the two. And so you can hear this in this mutual birthing. And so then he quotes Origen, and I'll read that again. Origen says, "We are not only inborn in the Son, we are born out and born in again, and are born anew and immediately in the Son. I say, and it is true, that in every good thought or good intent or good work, we are ever born anew in God." Again, like, you can hear the emphasis that it's unconditional in terms of any circumstantial condition, right? We could be involved in something beautiful, something ordinary, like the whole gamut. And I think what Eckhart here is emphasizing here is it's not about any of that content. It's the way to where we're coming from in that relation. And he goes on, therefore, as I said quite recently, the Father has only the one Son, and the less we turn our aims or attention to anything other than God, and insofar as we look to nothing outward, so we are transformed in the Son. And so far, the Son is born in us, and we are born in the Son, and become the one Son. So, I think how we want to read this, right, when he talks about here, so far as we look to nothing outward. So because, he's teaching us how to see, right? This is, I think, what he's doing is like, he's teaching us how to see the divine in all relations, at every single moment, at every single occasion, that it is possible for us to have a way of seeing that co-realizes the whole thing, right? And so when he says, when he talks about, so far as we look to nothing outward, so we are transformed in the Son. So, so I think we want to hear this, because usually when we think of outward and inward, because we're so Cartesian, right, we usually think about like, outward is outside of my skin and inward is subjective. It's inside of my skin. But I don't think at the time that he was writing, this is still, I think, before Descartes, I think. So that's not, I think what he's really talking about is to look outward is more like to look at just the surface, and to look inward is something like looking into the depth, right? So in a certain sense, he's having us shift the way that we comport, right, to appearance, and to see deeper into the appearance and relate to that depth, right? And that depth is you would say is the inward, and outward would be the surface of things. Like, in some sense, in many ways, I'm also co-reading Mauricio Ponte's last book that he never finished because he died before it was complete, The Visible and the Invisible. And that whole book, Ponte is phenomenologically really showing how that there's like the unity between the visible and the invisible is profound, right? And in a phenomenological way, Ponte's he's really trying to articulate this way that actually the visible, right, is co-saturated with the invisible. And in some ways, I think that Eckhart is kind of getting it to the same thing. Is like, in some ways, he wants us to become unblind, right, to the invisible within the visible, and to see that what makes the visible real is the inexhaustible depth, right? The part that we don't see with our eyes, right? But is what affords the visible to shine, and such that we can taste that shining all the way into the invisible. And in many ways, you could say that, many artists are doing this, right? Like Cezanne, when he's painting, right? He is not copying the visible. actually he's through the constraints of his canvas and colors, he's actually in some sense he's he's painting and affording the being of the rose of the landscape, right, to shine through, and he's actually drawing out the invisible in the visible of whatever he's painting, and that's what he's drawing out. And in some ways, I think that that kind of gets at the same thing that Eckhart is really talking about with the way that we relate with everything. Okay, I'm going to go on to the next paragraph. This is page 5, second paragraph. God has, it is true, poured out satisfaction and joy into creatures. But the root of all satisfaction and the essence of all joy, these God has kept back in himself. Here's an analogy. Fire sends its roots out into water in the form of heat. And when the fire is removed, for a while, the warmth remains in the water and also in the wood. The fire having been present, the heat remains just so long, according to the strength of the fire that was there. But the sun illuminates the air and shines through it, but does not pour forth roots into it. For when the sun is no more present, there is no more light. And that is what God does with creatures. He casts the light of satisfaction upon creatures, but the root of all satisfaction he has reserved to himself, for he would have us for himself alone, and for no one else. God adorns himself and proffers himself to the soul, and has drawn on all the resources of his Godhead to make himself agreeable to the soul, because God wishes alone to please the soul and will brook no rival. God will endure no jostling, and does not wish us to strive for or desire anything but himself. So again, here, in this analogy, right? A beautiful analogy, there, because there's a sense of that which is satisfying in creatures, right? Is what's satisfying is that the warmth, right, left over from the flame is reached into it and it's there. However, what remains withdrawn, right, is the root. And it's the root that Eckhart is beckoning us to hearken, to hear, to see, to mind, to comport ourselves in such a way that we can taste this joy and this satisfaction all the way into the very root, which is in some sense transcends the thing itself. And so he's teaching us to taste in this way, right? He's wanting us to realize that in every creature, in every form, in everything that we see, that if we stop at just the thing, we ultimately are not fully fed, because the root is he remains. God is that mystery that withdrawing mystery that also shines forth, that moreness, right? And that if we can, what he's saying is what's possible here is to in all of our relations, right, is to mind into the very root of things. Okay, he goes on. Now, there are some people who consider themselves very holy and perfect. They make a great parade and use big words. And yet they seek and desire so many things and want so many possessions and pay so much regard to themselves and to this and that. They claim to be contemplatives, and yet they can brook no contradiction. You can be sure they are far from God and have not attained that union. The prophet says, quote, I have poured out my soul within myself, unquote. But St. Augustine says something better. He says, I have poured out my soul over myself. It must be so that the soul rises above herself if she is to become one in the soul. By the way, I just love that he just assumes the soul is feminine. I love that he calls the soul her. It must be so that the soul rises above herself if she is to become one in the Son. And the more she goes out of herself, the more she will become one with the Son. St. Paul says, quote, we are to be transformed into the same image that he is, unquote. Again, he's further emphasizing, right, this minding the ineffable. And again, that it's not about the content, right? It's really about the way that we see and relate to whatever's happening into the very root, right? The sense of the very source of things, right? And I had this. This is probably a way to get at this. I had this really amazing conversation with Riff'N, my wife, not too long ago. It was one of those moments that my Teague, my son, who's 2.5, he was napping, and the grandparents weren't home, and so we had this kind of just perfect little moment where we were both sitting on the floor in the living room, and we just got to talking about this experience of sharing the witnessing of Teague, my child, and my wife was talking about. We got into this conversation about this experience of what that's like, and she was emphasizing in this moment. She's talking about this way in which what shines forth from him is this adorableness, right? This cuteness, like there's something he does, or there's a way that he looks at you, or there's, just something that he does where it's like there's an adorableness there it's so totally adorable that you just like want to eat him or something. If you've been around kids, I think that's, a pretty common experience. Like when you get really present to they have this certain look or something like that, and they're so adorable that it almost hurts. Like you literally just want to eat them or something. And then he says, but there's these other ways of witnessing him where it's distinct, right? Where it's not adorableness, but rather you look at him and he's beautiful. And we started talking about the difference between the two. And she said, it is profoundly different, right? And where where we kind of got to in the conversation was, when he's adorable, it's usually it's like moments where it's something, there's some way he is, or something that he's doing or saying that you catch this glimpse of adorableness. But when what shines forth is his beauty, is those moments, right, are moments in which what shines forth is that he is. Whereas adorableness is usually bound up, I think, with, it's funny with the adorableness. If you kept increasing it, you couldn't tolerate it anymore, right? But with the beauty, right, where there's just, when you look at him and you are just struck and drawn in, he's beautiful. And those moments are not particularly bound up with any whats or hows, right? Like in the adorableness. When he's beautiful, it's that he is. And I think in some way, this is what Eckhart is kind of getting at, right? Is that when we can relate to things, not just in what they are or how they are, but in the dimension of that this is, right? In its very thatness, its being. This is the attunement I believe he's wanting us to mind, to realize. Okay, we have one more paragraph. We're now on page 6, second paragraph. It has been written that a virtue is no virtue unless it comes from God, or through God, or in God. One of these things must always be. If it were otherwise, it would not be a virtue. For whatever one seeks without God is too small. Virtue is God, or without mediation in God. But I am not going to tell you now which is the best. Now you might say, quote, "Tell us, sir, what is that? How could we be without mediation in God by striving and aiming for nothing but God? How could we be so poor and give up all things like that?" That is a very hard saying, that we should desire no reward, unquote. Be assured, God will not fail to give us everything. Even if he had sworn it, he still could not refrain from giving to us. It is far more necessary for him to give than for us to receive. But we should not seek it. For the less we seek or desire it, the more God gives. So I hear right in that part right? He's giving a hint here. And how do we mine this root, right? How do we relate to whatever's here and into its thatness, right? Is he saying the hint is that is to not seek it? So he says it is far more necessary for him to give than for us to receive. But we should not seek it, for the less we seek or desire it, the more God gives. So in other words, it's really interesting. Like, he says it's like, so this, let's think about this for a moment. So, in other words, God, this unity, wants to give, right? In fact, that's what's really important, is him giving to us. And yet, if all of our attention is on getting, right, we're kind of already missing the point in some sense. Because if we're really relating authentically to God as the ineffable, apophatic unity, that if we're really in right relation, it's in some sense, it's so wanting to love us. It's like he's pressing. It's almost like he's pressing. God is pressing into us, like he is that he loves us, right? So in some sense, he's saying, if you focus on getting, right, you're already missing, you're already mistaken, right? Because this unity is so wanting to give, right? If we seek it, if we want it to give, we're already missing its nature. So he's giving us a hint here that, in other words, this receiving from God, this gift from God, I think what he's pointing at is it's so near to us, right, that we could easily miss it by wanting it. That if we refrain from seeking, the understanding that we draw from, which can refrain from seeking, is already in relation with God, because God is pure giving. I just really get this sense it's like God is in some way kind of nearer to ourselves than ourselves. It's in some way it's so close. It's so close to us that if we seek it, we're already ahead of it or missing it in that sense. So I go on. In this way, God intends only that we may be the richer and receive the more. In this way, God intends only that we may be the richer and receive the more. Sometimes when I am to pray, I say a word or two, and then I say, quote, Lord, it is so. Lord, it is so little that we ask for thee. If anyone were to ask it of me, I should do it for him and for thee. It is 100 times easier, and thou dost it more willingly. And if we were to ask thee for anything greater, thou couldst easily give it, and the greater it is, the more gladly thou givest. For God is ready to give great things, if only we could leave all things in justice, that we may thus pursue justice in wisdom and hunger and thirst after it, and that we may be sated. May God help us. Amen.